When it comes to writing unique, impactful melodies, it's hard to compete with Jaga Jazzist. And yes, that is apparently how to pronounce their name, being as they're from Norway. Over the band's nearly 30-year history, they've explored a sort of middle ground between the austere, wistful jazz of the Nordic jazz scene and the experimental electronica that's characteristic of the Ninja Tune music label, on which they put out several of their albums. Their more recent albums have leaned in the direction of post-rock or synth-driven space rock, but I want to take a look at a track from their early career 2001 album, A Living Room Hush. There's very little rock influence on this album, which instead places jazz arrangements over skittish electronic rhythms. And on the track Airborne, Jaga Jazzist's approach to melodic development is on display in its purest form. Let's take a listen. The track begins with some swingy, lo-fi drum samples, as well as a few sparse, jazzy chords on electric piano. Eventually, these chords coalesce into this section's main progression. There's a few different ways to look at this chord progression. The most obvious pattern here is the chromatic movement of these chords' root notes. After moving up a minor third from B-flat to D-flat, they descend chromatically 3 steps back to the initial chord. This type of movement is fairly common in jazz and related genres. In fact, one could easily compare Airborne's progression to the jazz standard On Green Dolphin Street. Sometimes the E-flat minor 7 is labeled as a G-flat major 7 over E-flat, a typical median substitution, and this gives us the same chromatic line. The main difference is that On Green Dolphin Street's chords are all major, giving it a light, dreamy aesthetic, whereas in Airborne all but one is minor, giving it a sense of dark intrigue. The underlying theory of these movements often relates to tritone substitution. Look at the 2-5-1 progression so common in jazz. The tritone inside the 5-dominant-7 chord also occurs in a dominant chord whose root is a tritone away. It's the tension and release between this tritone and the 1 chord's major third interval that creates a sense of resolution, so we can substitute this chord, forming a 2-flat-2-1 progression, whose root notes have a distinct downward chromatic trajectory. On Green Dolphin Street sees a similar substitution, with the F7 replacing a C-flat-7 chord, which would have made a 5-1 sort of resolution to the F-flat major 7. But in many cases, similar chromatic changes will avoid dominant chords. We might expect the flat 2 chord here to be dominant as well, but it's voiced as a major 7th instead. And the first section of Airborne, in fact, has no dominant chords at all. Its movements have a similar flavor to those created by tritone substitution, but without that technique's clear-cut tension and release. Instead, just a lurking sense of mystery. Still, can we assign chord functions to this progression? The initial B-flat minor 9 seems like a suitable 1 chord, but then we end up with this progression. These labels are kind of unsatisfying, especially with this outlandish flat 3 minor chord, which lacks a clear connection to the other chords. Fortunately, there's a better way to look at things, but it won't become clear until the section develops further. At this point, we've been neglecting one of the most powerful aspects of this track, namely the saxophone melody, which soon joins the arrangement. You probably noticed some of the repeated motifs, but let's appreciate how utterly consistent they are. Almost the entire melody can in fact be boiled down to 3 distinct shapes: an upward movement by fourths, a 16th note trill or mordant-like figure, and a shape formed by a whole step on top of a half step, played either like this or like this. Let's take another listen to the melody with these motifs highlighted. There's only one exception to these shapes. Over here, a downward movement by a fourth, which at least has some resemblance to the first shape. But otherwise, it's stunning how these motifs are carefully interwoven with this section's unusual harmonic changes. Even more stunning is the imagery that these shapes manage to evoke. This is an instrumental track, and without lyrics, the only hint we have at the track's meaning is the title, Airborne. Yet the melody manages to capture exactly that feeling and even elaborate on it. The first shape launching us upward, the second shape a delicate fluttering of wings, and the third shape only dipping us downward, never descending in full. The narrower half step on the bottom of this shape even seems to be the result of an upward pressure, like the density of air pressing up on the bottom of a wing. In the second repetition, part of this melody is played an octave up, giving an even greater impression of altitude. When it comes back down to the original octave, it does so starting with these two sets of upward fourths, attempting to sustain its sense of height. These impressions are strengthened by the harmonic interaction between the melody and the chords. More specifically, the melody emphasizes notes with bright qualities, especially by using scale degrees which are sharper than expected. When we first hear the B-flat minor 9, we might expect the track to use the default natural minor scale. But the melody quickly incorporates a G natural, reflecting the brighter B-flat Dorian mode instead of the natural minor's G-flat, which does in fact appear over the second B-flat minor 9. Then we move to the fairly dark-sounding D-flat minor chord, and if we were simply modulating to a diatonic D-flat minor scale, then we would have to add not only a G-flat, but also the C-flat before getting around to the chord's F-flat, and perhaps even further to a B double-flat. But here, the B single-flat and C natural sustain the sharper scale degrees used over the previous chord, as do the B single-flat and G natural that appear over the D-flat minor chord later on. Ultimately, we can describe these variations as a D-flat melodic minor sharp 4 scale. The next chord is C minor 7, which by using the G natural further commits us to the brighter B-flat Dorian setting. Of course, this setting implies a relatively dark C Phrygian scale containing a D-flat, but over the second C minor 7 chord, the melody uses both a D natural and a B natural, indicating the brighter C harmonic minor scale. And then finally we reach the C-flat major 7 chord. Over the first version of this chord, the melody still manages to incorporate a C natural, in literal terms a very unusual sharp 1 scale degree relative to the C-flat, though as a brief passing tone it's not overly dissonant. The second C-flat major 7 has a more conventional melody, but one which still highlights the F, a sharp 4 scale degree, being the most characteristic note of this chord's bright Lydian mode. You'll notice how each instance of the third melodic shape coincides with these sharpened features, giving further credence to the feeling that this shape's half step is due to some kind of upward pressure. But more generally, these features elevate the melody beyond the normal constraints of these chords, so even while the progression is dark and vaguely static, the melody is light and, well, airborne. At this point, we can speculate further about the chord functions in this section. Much of the melody is closely related not to the B-flat natural minor scale, but the B-flat Dorian scale. This is typical of the 2 minor chord in a major key progression, so let's look at this progression from the perspective of the 1, A-flat major. From this perspective, we end up with 2 minor, 4 minor, 3 minor, and flat 3 major. To me, these functions make a lot more sense. The 2 minor to 4 minor change is probably one of the most common chromatic median changes, and it's usually accompanied by the harmonic major scale, which is a mode of the D-flat melodic minor sharp 4 scale used over these chords. The 4 minor to 3 minor change is a little less typical, but can easily be explained by the 3 minor chord serving as a median substitution for the 1 major chord, making this change analogous to the very common minor plagal cadence. Using this substitution, we also get a 1 major to flat 3 major change, which is perhaps a little bold, borrowing from the A-flat Dorian mode, but not unprecedented. In fact, it's quite a lot like the initial chord change in On Green Dolphin Street. And then finally, there is a flat 3 major to 2 minor change, which is diatonic in the A-flat Dorian mode while also smoothing the transition back to the key of A-flat major. Ultimately, there are many ways to interpret this progression, and you could probably use both sets of functions to develop melodies or improvise over it. The first 2 changes have very strong identities in the key of A-flat major, but the way the last 2 chords cycle back to the first also makes a fair amount of sense in the key of B-flat minor. There's so much detail in this one section, despite how sparing the composition is, literally just 16 bars of melody over a 4-chord progression. But now we can move on to the track's other section, which, although less conceptual, still has some interesting ideas. This section begins with a solo saxophone part over some angular electronic percussion in a 7/8 meter. With each repetition, a new component is added. First a bass riff, then more fleshed out percussion and electric piano, and then this section's main melody, with an additional repetition adding even more instrumental density. Let's listen to the 3 main steps of this evolution. Even without the electric piano chords which fill out the arrangement, there is a pretty clear chord progression occurring. First B flat minor, C flat, and F7, and then simply B flat minor to C flat and back. The C flat should be relatively familiar from the previous section, but now it makes more sense to consider it a flat 2 major chord in B flat minor, since we also now have the F7, a clear 5 dominant 7 chord in that key. The tritonal movement from C flat to F7 has a bold Neapolitan sound, and the 5-1 change has a sense of motivation and energy that is new to the track. The previous section, for all its impressions of weightless flight, was still oddly static and gentle, almost more like a daydream of flight than the actual thing. But in this second section, we're starting to move for real, gaining speed down the runway with each added layer. This dynamic quality is reflected in the rhythmic orientation of this section's melodies. Squaring off against this new, uneven 7/8 meter, the initial saxophone melody bobs and weaves like a boxer, with each pickup phrase leading into the first beat lasting a different length and having a different shape. The upper melody has similar features, alternating long sustained notes with rhythmically unexpected lead-in phrases that either pick up or leave off at different places in the meter. This type of rhythmic variety and melodic flexibility is common throughout Jaga Jazzist's entire discography, though it sits distinct from standard jazz or funk syncopations. The exact nature of this difference is hard to describe more specifically, but whatever its true nature, it gives this section's build-up an inimitable sense of energy. Just as the build-up reaches its peak, this section cuts off abruptly, replacing the last two 7/8 measures with one measure of 4/4 before the track explodes into a fiery saxophone solo. Unfortunately, any transcription of this solo would likely fail to really capture what makes it work. It's actually fairly simple on a harmonic level, sticking largely to B-flat minor, and often giving a special emphasis to this scale's major second. But really, these features are less important than the feel of the playing. The saxophone growls, screams, and cries with long sustained notes which gradually bend pitch and show off variations in volume, timbre, and vibrato. These are interspersed by lightning-quick melodic phrases which communicate more like gestures than discrete series of notes. The only way to really understand this solo is just to listen to its textures and feel its emotions. And just like that, the solo ends, abruptly falling to near silence before repeating a single iteration of the first section's melody with sparing chords and no percussion or other instrumentation. Now the opening theme of Airborne plays more like a haunting memory, as if the foregoing solo was just an incredible dream. This is how the track ends. It's really amazing how it manages to tell such a complete, specific story, at least on an emotional level, inside the span of 5 minutes and with only a few really distinct sections. In my view, this makes Jaga Jazzist true masters at their craft. This concludes my analysis of Airborne. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.